Thank you. My name is Gail Geisenhainer. I serve this congregation as senior minister, and I welcome everyone to the First Unitarian Universalist Congregation of Ann Arbor to the 2014 Klein Lecture. Robert Klein joined our congregation when he became impressed with how many of the folks here were active and engaged in projects to make the world more just, to make the world more peaceful. He realized that members of the First Unitarian Universalist congregation were not just concerned, they were also active. Robert Klein wanted this lectureship to be a celebration of social justice activists. Speakers in the 24-year history of the Klein Lecture have been actively involved in their various communities. They have been activists, hands-on, doing something to make the world a better place. This lectureship is dedicated to the memory of Robert and his wife Ruth Klein, that their spirit, the spirit of peace and goodwill and justice, might flourish. The lectureship is sponsored by memorial funds donated by friends of Robert and Ruth and their children, Fred and Andrew. And I believe Fred is here. I did see him earlier. Would you wave to us, Fred, so we can say thank you. Thank you for showing here and being here. One of the things that powers this community is that we have I-thou relationships, we hope, more often than I-it relationships. So it really matters to us to have a Klein person here with us in the lecture. It matters a lot. So welcome everyone. Welcome to our congregation. Welcome to the 2014 Klein Lecture. Introducing our lecturer this afternoon is Jenny Kropp. Jenny?
Good afternoon. I'm Jenny Kropp, and I have been involved with the UUSC Coffee Project in this church since 2006. The New York Review of Books wrote in 2002, William Schultz has done more than anyone in the American human rights movement to make human rights issues known in the United States, end of quote. Bill Schultz, with passion and dedication, has traveled the globe from refugee camps to the poorest villages, from prison cells to death row, in pursuit of a world free from human rights violations. Currently, he is president and CEO of the Unitarian Universalist Service Committee, promoting social, economic, and environmental justice around the world. An ordained UU minister, Dr. Schultz was president of the UUA from 1985 to 93 and executive director of Amnesty International from 1994 to 2006, where he headed the American section of the world's oldest and largest international human rights organization. During his 12 years at Amnesty, he led missions globally and many, many miles in the United States, promoting human rights causes. He's the author of several books on human rights, the latest being What Torture Taught Me, Essays on Justice and Theology, published last year. And so I'm deeply honored and delighted to welcome, as this year's Klein Lecture speaker, President of the UUSC, the Reverend Dr. Bill Schultz.
Thank you, Jenny. Very nice of you. And thanks to the Klein Lecture Committee, to Terry Madden, who initiated my presence here. My memory is I gave this lecture in 2003, so I'm not sure whether you're having me back because I did such a good job or because I did a poor job and you're taking pity and giving me another chance. But in either case, I'm delighted to be back here with you this weekend and for this lecture. If it's the latter of those two options, it recalls a speech that I gave at Pepperdine University a number of years ago when I was still with Amnesty. I thought it was a pretty good speech. But afterwards, a woman in the audience came up to me and she said, "Dr. Schulz, I couldn't hear a word you said." And thinking to be modest, I said, "Well, you're probably not missing much." And she said, "I know, that's what everybody told me." So I hope you have a different experience this afternoon. I've titled my remarks, excuse me, "The Human Rights Challenges of the 21st Century." That's a bit grandiose, particularly since we're only in the 14th year of that century, and my powers of prognostication are on a par with those of Calvin Coolidge, who, when he was once asked to predict what would happen if people lost their jobs, he replied, "Unemployment will result." But I had to give a title to this talk a number of months ago, and foolishly I ignored the advice of a professor of mine at Meadville Lombard Theological School, who taught us that if you ever needed to give a title for a sermon or a speech long before you knew exactly what you were going to talk about, you should always give the title, "Out of Ambiguity, Hope." That would cover all bases. Well, let's begin at the beginning. What are human rights? They are rules agreed to by the international community that describe a civilized society. That's what human rights are. Rules agreed to by the international community that describe a civilized society. A civilized society, for instance, doesn't torture or deny people fair trials. Therefore, we have a set of civil and political rights. A civilized society sees to it that its citizens have enough to eat, have a decent education, have adequate shelter from the elements. So we have a set of social and economic rights. Rules agreed to by the international community. And notice I said agreed to by the international community. This means that no one nation alone, no matter how powerful or how idiosyncratic its own cultural traditions, no one nation alone can decide what human rights are. The death penalty, for example, is a violation of internationally recognized rights. The United States considers the death penalty constitutional, but that does not make it consistent with human rights. The United States, in that respect, is a human rights outlaw. We can disagree with the judgments of the international community. We can contend in that matter that it is not uncivilized to execute those convicted fairly of capital crimes, but we cannot pretend that the death penalty is not a human rights violation, because Americans don't get to decide that all by ourselves. But where do human rights come from, and how does the international community decide what makes something a right? Well, there are only three choices for the sources of human rights. It's either God, natural law, or general human consensus. Now, the problem with God as the source of human rights ought to be obvious. Even within singular religious traditions, it's hard to agree on what God wants. An early Christian sect, for example, called Montanists. Montanists believed that only those who ate a steady diet of radishes would ever be saved. So if the Montanists' view had prevailed, Christians would take radishes with their communion rather than wafers. And natural law, not much better as a source of human rights. Natural law is pretty much in the eye of the beholder. The philosopher John Locke, the so-called father of natural law, believed that natural law required the recognition of the rights of everyone. Well, everyone except women and poor people. Natural law is a problematic source. So how do rights get recognized? Well, the poet Robert Frost said that poems begin with a lump in the throat. And human rights do too. And they have done so for almost 4,000 years, back at least to 1740 BC, when King Hammurabi codified his laws against unfair trials, torture, slavery. At the end of the day, the reason that any one of us cares about human rights is simply because we feel sick at heart at the sight of other people's misery. But which other people? Whose misery counts? You see, King Hammurabi's strictures against torture and slavery applied only to his own people, the Babylonians. As for the Assyrians, his archenemies, you could torture and enslave the Assyrians all you wanted to. And the guiding document of the French Revolution, the Declaration of the Rights of Man and the Citizens, or the U.S. Bill of Rights, these only help the French and the Americans. They don't do anything at all for the Thai or the Congolese. There's a wonderful old Chinese saying that you can stand on a hillside for a long, long time with your mouth wide open before a roast duck will fly into it. It took almost that long. Took a very long time for human beings to feel sick at heart at the sight of everybody's misery. Not just at the misery of my own clan or tribe or nation, not just at the misery of the nobles or the ruling class or the wealthy. Indeed, it was not until 1948, 3,688 years after Hammurabi, that the people of the world managed to agree that everybody's misery mattered. That was the year the United Nations adopted the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, a statement of some 33 civil, political, social, and economic rights that everyone can claim simply because they are human beings. The Universal Declaration and all the subsequent human rights instruments, conventions, covenants, treaties, decisions by international courts, judgments by international human rights organizations, all of that collectively defines human rights. And it reflects as close to a consensus as we're ever going to get about what a civilized society looks like, and therefore what makes a right a right. But who's paying attention? As we survey the world at large, it looks as if human rights face enormous perils. ISIS in Iraq, Russia in Ukraine, Israel and Hamas, police killings in Missouri. But if you take a little bit longer view, if you adopt Spinoza's diktat that we should always take the view from eternity, if you consider that before 1948, the concept of universal human rights did not even exist in any formalized way. You know, the genocide perpetrated by the Nazis broke no international law. If you take that long view, why, the progress that has been made in the last 66 years has been enormous. Shortly before I left my position at Amnesty, I gave a lecture at Syracuse University on the state of human rights around the world. And at a dinner beforehand, the president of the university asked a gathering of faculty members whether human rights were better or worse today than they had been 200 years before. And with one exception, all of the faculty members insisted that human rights were in worse shape at the moment than they had been 2 millennia before. And after listening to all this moaning, I couldn't contain myself further, and I said in my customarily tactful way, "Are you folks nuts?" I said, "Why, in just the 12 years I've been with Amnesty, we've seen a huge growth in democracy around the globe. We've seen war crimes tribunals established for the former Yugoslavia, Rwanda, Sierra Leone. We've seen the British law lords rule in 1999 that Augusto Pinochet, and by implication any former national leader anywhere, is not protected from being prosecuted for human rights crimes simply because of some kind of notion of sovereign immunity. We've seen the creation of the International Criminal Court. We've seen all but 2 countries, Somalia and the United States, ratify the Convention on the Rights of the Child. We've seen the U.S. Supreme Court rule unconstitutional the execution of children and of the mentally retarded. And you don't think that we are better off today than in 1806 when a slaveholder, Thomas Jefferson, could get elected president? Well, these were a bunch of academics. I know you understand that that made no impact whatsoever upon them. Had I been responding to those professors today, I would have added that perhaps the most promising development of the past 10 years has been the explosion in the number of human rights groups that exist around the world and the growing sophistication of their techniques. A friend of mine recently did a study for the U.S. Holocaust Museum and identified 115 organizations working on the prevention of genocide alone. And the 12 major ones were all founded in the past 7 years. And the same is true of national and regional human rights organizations. Virtually every country, even some of the most repressive, like Belarus or Cambodia, can now boast indigenous human rights groups which track violations, report abuses, hold their governments to account. Furthermore, these proliferating groups no longer must rely on 20th century techniques alone to carry on the good fight, as Amnesty did when people back in the 60s were writing letters in their kitchens. Online generated protests, we know, of course, are now the norm, but things like satellite imaging are now being used to expose slave labor camps in North Korea. Satellite images were focused on several villages in Darfur, Sudan, at risk of genocide, at risk of massacre. And as long as those satellite images were focused on those villages, no massacres took place. So there have been a number of very positive developments, but that, of course, can't obviate the fact that human rights do face significant challenges. And I want to focus on 4 of them this afternoon. The first is, can universal rights and values ever trump individual cultural identity? It's a huge tension. The second, can human rights ever be enforced? Third, will climate change make human rights obsolete? And finally, will the United States be a human rights leader or an outlier? So let's start with this first one. Can universal values ever truly overcome our individual cultural identities? Adam Smith advised us to love our country, but merely, he said, merely, quote, as part of a great society of mankind. And Immanuel Kant called for global patriotism. But other philosophers like Alasdair MacIntyre, often dubbed communitarians, believe that human beings are lost unless they can find their identity in a nation or a culture or a religion. When we are asked the question, who are you? We are more likely to answer, I'm an American, or I'm a white male, or a Unitarian Universalist, than we are to say, I'm a citizen of the world. And if we do say, I'm a citizen of the world, it doesn't give us much information except that we're probably some kind of pointed-headed liberal. Moreover, we who are educated in the Western tradition are taught to show respect for different cultures. Indeed, we so often self-correct for our Western biases by being reticent to condemn behavior in other cultural contexts that we would have no hesitation in criticizing if it took place in our own. Maybe the Saudi practice of amputating the hand of a thief is gruesome, but who are we to judge? The very mark of cosmopolitanism today is an all-pervasive tolerance. And if you're not tolerant, you're not considered a liberal. You're not considered enlightened. We've learned well the lesson taught by the Persian king Darius, who asked a group of Greeks what might induce them to eat rather than to burn their dead. Nothing could make anyone do something so atrocious, they replied. And then Darius introduced them to some denizens of India who regularly consumed their dead. And the Indians said, what might persuade you to do something as awful as to burn your deceased? Nothing could make us do something so abominable. But the fact is that universal human rights reject such relativism, and it may make us liberals uncomfortable. Universal human rights fly in the face of our well-cultivated impulse to withhold judgment. Amputating the hand of a thief is wrong. Eating the living, if not the dead, is wrong. Female genital cutting is wrong, regardless of cultural prerogatives. So how do we resolve this tension between universality and particularity? Well, we ask one simple question. Where does the power lie? Does power lie with the thieves whose hands are cut off, with those who are eaten, with the women who experience female genital mutilation? Are they the powerful ones? Or does it lie with the prosecutor or the chieftain or the cutter? Does it lie, in other words, with the victims and the less powerful? Or does it lie with inflictors of pain and wielders of power? And the answer, of course, is that the powerful have usually made the rules, the wealthy, the better educated, the males. But you see, human rights depict a society in which the interests of the less powerful are taken equally into account, a society in which the rules are made by all. And when that happens, cultural practices tend to gravitate toward the mean. The victims of atrocities or discrimination have more in common with one another than they do with their fellow nationals or their sister ethnics or their brother tribespeople. They constitute, in a word, a community of suffering, a global community of suffering. And when those who suffer help make the rules, then the rules reflect a high degree of generosity and pity. Human rights are promises that the less powerful demand of the powerful. And if the less powerful are not satisfied, the result will eventually be revolution, or at least hundreds of thousands of people in the streets of Hong Kong. I once asked a Chinese dissident who had been freed after 17 years of prison in China. I asked him what he thought about the notion of Asian values, the notion that Asian values require the interests of the community to be put above the interests of the individual, and that therefore the notion that torture is somehow wrong when it is done in the interests of the state and the interests of the community is a Western concept. And he asked me a simple question. He said, am I not an Asian? Am I not a Chinese? No one asked me whether torturing me was good in the interests of the community. Human rights are promises that the less powerful demand of the powerful. And the challenge is clear. How do we ensure that the victims have as great a voice as the perpetrators in the design of human rights rules, and hence that universal values trump narrower cultural and religious identities? That's the first challenge that the human rights movement will face in this century. And it's made only worse by religious extremism of all stripes and an obsession with sovereignty by nationalists of all regions, including, of course, in this country. So that leads to the second challenge. Once we've agreed on the rules, will those rules ever actually be enforced? China, for example, has some of the strictest laws against torture in the entire world. But torture is rampant in China. Because there is no international sheriff to arrest human rights violators, human rights are in large measure self-enforced. But there are a few things, there are 5 things to be exact, that we can do to encourage governments and corporations to live up to the human rights rules. First, of course, we can shame them. We can expose their abuses to international scrutiny. That's the principal strategy that Amnesty International relied upon for 53 years, just telling the truth about what a government is doing to its own citizens. And Amnesty estimates that it works about 40% of the time. But many countries like Russia and China, North Korea, sometimes the United States, don't care what the world thinks. So shaming is often not an effective way to enforce human rights. Gradually, over the years, a second mechanism has arisen. Legal sanctions have become a second prominent arrow in the human rights quiver, with the creation of the war crimes tribunals for Rwanda and the former Yugoslavia, and especially the creation of the International Criminal Court. But the ICC has managed in 14 years to convict only 2 defendants, and the courts have no power to take into custody those who are charged with crimes. So the promise of international justice is neither swift nor sure. Economic sanctions, they constitute a third way to enforce human rights, and these have been far more successful than their critics acknowledge. Burma, now called Myanmar, I still call it Burma, for example, was persuaded to tiptoe its way toward democracy in good measure because Burmese oligarchs realized that once they had stolen millions of dollars through corrupt practices, as long as the country was under economic sanction from the West, they would have no other place than China in which to invest their ill-gotten gains. And so they decided to open the country up in order to invest in the West. And for all the criticism of President Obama's weak-kneed response to Russian aggression in Ukraine, the fact is that Putin has muted his aggression because he is uncertain whether the Russian economy can truly withstand economic isolation from the West. The problem with economic sanctions, of course, is that they are applied sporadically and interdependent as our world is, result in blowback to harm the sanctioning countries as well as the sanctioned. It's not a coincidence that no human rights advocate has ever seriously advocated that the U.S. impose widespread economic sanctions on China, because as the Chinese finance minister said not long ago, it's not wise to make your banker angry. Which leads to a fourth tool for the enforcement of human rights: military intervention. I want to dwell a bit longer on this topic because it is so controversial, especially on the left. There's no question, of course, that wars have been fought for egregiously illegitimate reasons, the most recent, the war in Iraq. Nor is there any doubt that all use of force, even the most well-intentioned, carries with it the danger of exacerbating a problem and causing harm to innocent people. But do these facts mean that force should never be employed to stop massive human rights crimes? I think the answer is no. On 2 reasons for that. The first is that it strikes me as just a little too easy for us comfortable Americans to be telling the most miserably oppressed people in the world that we will never resort to violence to protect them because war might do more harm than good. There is a smell to refugee camps, which once you have inhaled it, you never forget. It is a smell of goat dung and human waste, of sweat and tears and blood, but it is also a smell of desperation that gives way to sagging shoulders and the decay of the human soul. Because a body can be clothed in the raiment of fear, or stalked daily by death for only so long before the soul, whatever it is that makes human beings human, before that begins to collapse upon itself, as surely as the shoulders do. When I visited the enormous Kalma refugee camp in southern Darfur, 90,000 teeming people who had been burned out of their villages, their menfolk murdered, many of the women battered and sexually assaulted. I was struck by 1,000 things, by the children who called out to us repeatedly in English the only word that they knew. Okay, okay, with the thumb sign up. Okay, okay. When nothing was okay. Absolutely nothing was okay there. or the police sent by the Sudanese government to guard the camp, many of whom were suspected of having raped and murdered more than one of those they were supposed to be guarding. But what really took my breath away was this: a young woman who, amid the utter squalor and degradation, her clothes, such as they were, tattered and falling off her, but who wore around her neck a lovely piece of jewelry, probably just glass, but a turquoise-colored glass that sparkled constantly in the relentless sun. At first, I thought it was a religious symbol, and I asked our Arabic-speaking translator to ask her what it meant. She says, "It is me," he told me. And at first, I didn't understand. I thought she had simply said, "It is mine," and he had mistranslated. "Sorry, what did he say? What did she say it was?" I asked. She said it is hers. No, he said. No, he said definitively. She said, "It is me." And suddenly I understood. When the women workers who had led the strike against the textile mills in Lawrence, Massachusetts in 1912 were being hosed down and beaten by the police, they shouted that famous slogan, "Give us bread and roses." And that chant, "Bread and roses," we demand bread to eat, yes, but we demand our dignity too. That's been a watchword, of course, of the labor movement ever since. And here in this dreadful camp was that very same demand. This piece of jewelry, this small sparkling piece of glass around my neck, this is me. This is how I know that though I am mere flesh, brute flesh, bone, water, swollen tongue, excrement, stained thighs, my most private parts exposed for all to see, that though I am brute flesh right now in this horrific camp, I am not just that. I retain a tiny hint of my humanity. I require bread to live, of course. So do the goats, sheep, pigs, bless them all. But none of them decorate themselves with turquoise glass. Only human beings do that. Only human beings look on a sparkling piece of glass and call it beautiful. And I am a human being still. And I demand roses too. Who are we sitting in our comfortable homes in Ann Arbor to tell that woman that we can't save her because of our vaunted moral objections to war? Sure, it would be best if she and all the other refugees in that camp rose up against their oppressors themselves. We all admire the students of the Serbian Revolution, well-educated, sophisticated about the media, who in the year 2000 used their cell phones and text messages to summon tens of thousands of their fellow Serbs to Belgrade to overthrow the dictator Milosevic nonviolently. But Darfur, Sudan was not. And utterly chaotic Syria is not the Serbia of 2000. They are not well-fed Serbia. They are not well-educated, electronically well-connected Serbia. They are not the Serbia of huge trucks that can block well-paved superhighways and bring the nation to a standstill. Who are we to tell them that they must suffer in silence? Violence takes many forms, not just those of guns and knives and howitzers. One dies as readily of hunger as of wounds, of the death of the spirit as readily as that of the body. There truly is no peace without justice, and those who shout peace, peace, without pointing a viable way to justice are collaborators with the oppressors, just as surely as if they had supplied them with arms or turned the keys of their jail cells. And the second reason I don't altogether rule out the use of violence for humanitarian purposes is this: of all the tragic aspects of the U.S.'s post-9/11 misadventures, and especially the horrendous war in Iraq, perhaps the greatest tragedy was that America's arrogance and sense of exceptionalism, the notion that we made the rules and so we could break them at will, have made it far more difficult for us to provide leadership to the world, moral or military, even when doing so militarily, is in the best interest of a long-suffering humanity. A NATO-supplied no-fly zone over Darfur, for example, in the mid-2000s would have stopped the genocide dead in its tracks, because the Janjaweed militia, who were largely, though not exclusively, responsible for the killing, they would not have operated without the cover of the Sudanese Air Force. But the moral authority of the U.S. was so compromised by Iraq. The U.S. was so overextended in Iraq and Afghanistan. Our credibility in the Islamic world was so low. The American people were so wary of further military commitments that we allowed 250,000 people to die and 2.5 million to be displaced without lifting a single weapon to stop it. Now, I readily admit that my view of all this is colored by my experience of Rwanda. The 1994 genocide in Rwanda took place 2 months after I had assumed the leadership of Amnesty, and I will forever be haunted by our inability to do more to stop it. Especially tormenting is how little force would have been required. General Romeo Dallaire, who was the Canadian general in charge of UN troops in Rwanda when the killing began, who I've had the privilege to have met, who subsequently suffered a breakdown over his own failure to save lives, who is one of the great unsung heroes of my generation, Romeo Dallaire, asked for only 1,500 soldiers to save the lives of close to 1 million people. Only 1,500 soldiers, because they were opposing people who were murdering with machetes. Only 1,500 armed soldiers to save 1 million. And Kofi Annan and Bill Clinton made sure that he didn't get them. When wickedness is in fashion, it is sometimes simply impossible to secure a just peace through nonviolent means. But how do we know when wickedness is truly in fashion and not just the whim of some dreadful fashion designer? Well, fortunately, just as international justice has evolved over the past years, so has the concept of legitimate humanitarian intervention. It's called the responsibility to protect. And in 2005, the United Nations adopted guidelines as to when such protection is required and when such intervention is justified. It must, for example, be designed to counter large-scale loss of life or ethnic cleansing. It must be a last resort. It must receive some type of international imprimatur. Had these guidelines been followed, we would have never invaded Iraq in the first place, but we certainly would have taken far more proactive steps to stop the slaughter in Darfur. So a fourth legitimate tool for the enforcement of human rights is military intervention. But such intervention is, and it ought to be, rare, and such intervention can do nothing to address abuses of social rights like the widespread violence against women. It cannot stop the deprivation of economic rights caused by pervasive poverty. To address those crimes, and they are crimes, requires the fifth and final instrument with which to enforce human rights, and that is massive, nonviolent citizen action. Such action can take the form of hundreds of thousands of people blocking the streets of Hong Kong, or it can take the form of hundreds of thousands of cell phones used as a vehicle for banking in the rural reaches of Africa, or it can take the form of thousands of same-sex couples getting married, or it can take the form of Malala inspiring a new generation of girls in the Asian subcontinent to complete their education and getting the Nobel Prize for it. Such citizen action does not always succeed in reaching its goals right away, but the truth is that there is no more surefire way to bring about change in human rights than this, an inspired citizenry intent on ushering in a new world. But of course, one of the realities of that new world is climate change, which threatens to wipe away all human rights progress. I'm not just talking about the threats to all of our welfares caused by rising sea levels and expanding drought. I'm talking about the fact that these threats and scarcities will inevitably bring greater competition for resources and hence greater violence. In fact, it's already happened. It's no coincidence that Rwanda had the highest population density per square mile in all of Africa at the time of the 1994 genocide. And similarly, the genocide in Darfur, Sudan was prompted in good measure by climate change, by the fact that the encroaching desert in western Sudan began to gobble up pasture land that sedentary farming tribes had long drawn upon for their livelihoods. For many years, those farmers had permitted tribes of herders to cross their land with their goats and sheep. But as the farmers saw their land shrinking, they tried to put a stop to the grazing. That threatened the livelihood of the herders, and the result was a conflagration that claimed hundreds of thousands of lives. Climate change is not just a practical puzzle or an environmental problem. It is a full-fledged human rights challenge as well. But the very fact that we can speak of environmental issues as somehow distinct from human rights issues reflects the fact that we here in the United States have managed to delegitimize social and economic rights, such as the right to a healthy, sustainable environment, by associating them with communism and socialism, or at least do-gooder liberalism. But in fact, if you believe that having enough food to eat, or clean water to drink, or adequate shelter to live is in fact a higher order of human need than having, say, the right to vote, then you might want to argue that social and economic rights are the most important rights in the entire human rights collection. Addressing climate change goes hand in hand with protecting human rights all over the world, and that will be a third major challenge of the 21st century. Now, there are, of course, many other challenges facing us: the standoff between the Israelis and Palestinians, the plight of massive numbers of refugees, the continuing plague of child soldiers and sex trafficking and violence against women, 70% of whom have experienced physical or sexual violence in their lifetimes. But finally, I want to bring this home by asking whether the United States will reclaim the mantle of human rights leadership or throw up roadblocks of indifference or even obstruction to the realization of the human rights dream. The United States has always understood itself to be a champion of human rights around the world. Indeed, there would be no such thing as the contemporary human rights movement without the United States. Without Franklin Roosevelt not declaring in 1941 that there were 4 freedoms that every human being on earth had a right to claim: freedom of speech, freedom of religion, freedom from want, and freedom from fear. And 7 years later, Eleanor Roosevelt led the effort to make those freedoms more concrete with the adoption of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. Over the years, the United States has led the charge to defend many of those rights. And critical as we are of the United States, I have to tell you this. When I was with Amnesty and on a mission overseas anywhere in the world, and we had a list of prisoners of conscience whom we wanted the international community to intervene with the local government about, which embassy was it that would always receive our list and always take the list to the governing powers? It was not the Europeans. It was not the Asians. It was the American ambassador. Under Republican presidents or Democrats, it was always the American ambassador who was willing to take that list of prisoners to the government and plead on their behalf. Shortly before I left Amnesty, it was right before the end of the Bush administration, I was at an international conference in Geneva of world parliamentarians. And one after another of them got up and criticized me for the United States' human rights record. And I said finally to them, ladies and gentlemen, I said, you're talking to the wrong guy. I said, no one has been more outspoken against George W. Bush and his policies. No one has been more critical of this president or this government than I. But let me tell you this, sir, you from Mali, and you, ma'am, from Tunisia, and you, sir, from Saudi Arabia, I assure you that if you had been half as critical of your government as I have been of mine, you would not be here today, standing talking with us today. Let's not forget that. This is not to say, of course, that during the years of the Bush administration, the U.S.'s reputation for moral leadership did not tumble dramatically. We know that the Obama administration has slowed that decline, but it still continues. It's tempting, of course. We're all partisans here. It's tempting to attribute all of the problems of American human rights record to one president or one party and assume their complete eradication by another. But such simplistic thinking will not do. After all, I'm from Massachusetts, and it was in Massachusetts not too long ago that a Democratic state senator got on statewide radio one night and proclaimed in loud and fervent tones, "The Republican octopus is spreading its testicles across the entire Commonwealth." There are idiots in both parties. The hard truth is the decline in America's reputation for human rights leadership was rooted not just in the personality of George Bush, but in a predilection of the American character that goes way back to the founding of the country. Maybe it's because both Pilgrims and Puritans start with the letter P, I don't know, but we Americans have a hard time distinguishing between those two groups of people. The Pilgrims, remember, they were the ones who arrived at Plymouth Rock in 1620 to escape religious persecution. But the Puritans came 10 years later under the leadership of Governor John Winthrop, not because they were being persecuted, but in order to found a religious utopia. A more pure community, a new Jerusalem, a city set on a hill. And both the city part and the hill part were equally important. The Massachusetts Bay Colony was to be a city of great virtue. Here are the minutes of an early town meeting that catches that spirit perfectly. We passed 3 resolutions, the minutes read. Voted first that the earth is the Lord's and the fullness thereof. Voted second that the earth is given to the saints. Voted third that we are the saints. But what good was sainthood if nobody knew about your saintliness? So the hill part was just as important as the saintly city. That city had to be set not in a valley where no one could see it, but on a hill where it was visible to all. The eyes of all people are upon us, Governor John Winthrop said, and if we succeed, they shall say of later plantations, Lord, Lord, make it like that of New England. So from the very beginning, you see, this country saw itself as a model for the less enlightened to emulate, and that sense of moral mission has never left us. So when President Bush declared in his second inaugural that freedom is written in the human heart and that it is the policy of the United States to support the growth of democracy in every nation and culture with the ultimate goal of ending tyranny in the world, he was hearkening back to an age-old American assumption embodied, among other places, in the Declaration of Independence, a document that proclaimed the value of life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, not just for Americans, not just for British citizens, for all mankind. And that assumption is reflected every time a preacher or a politician refers to the United States as the greatest country on the face of the earth. So this predilection to believe in America's exceptional qualities and transforming mission, that's an old one. It's exactly what led to the notion that America is exempt from the rules by which everybody else has to play. Our reputation for human rights leadership declined because we indulged the narrow, paternalistic inclinations of the American character, a disdain for international covenants, a hypersensitivity to maintaining our sovereignty, a suspicion of international institutions like the United Nations or the International Criminal Court, a refusal to consider adopting international treaties, a scapegoating of immigrants. Will the U.S. ever reclaim proudly its mantle of human rights leadership? Well, fortunately, that part of the American tradition that is narrow and nationalistic, tempted by hubris, disdainful of diversity, that's not the only part of our heritage upon which to draw. For there is also an American tradition of generosity and hospitality, of rescue and liberation, of decency and virtue. And that part of the American tradition is manifest in a Roger Williams, who thought that the early colonists ought to actually pay the Indians for the land they stole from them. What a crazy idea. That's what got Williams sent to the horrible wilderness called Rhode Island. It's manifest in Judge Samuel Sewall, one of the judges at the Salem witchcraft trials, who only 7 years later stood up in front of his own congregation, tears streaming down his face, and begged forgiveness for his error, begged public forgiveness. It was the birth of public conscience in America. It's manifest in a William Lloyd Garrison, a Lydia Maria Child demanding an end to slavery. It's manifest in Elizabeth Cady Stanton expressing outrage when the World Anti-Slavery Society in London denied delegate status to women. Manifest in Sojourner Truth leading slaves to freedom. Manifest in Lincoln offering his adversaries, now think of this, 6 weeks before the end of the Civil War, offering the enemy malice toward none and charity for all. Imagine what would happen to an American president who did that today. It is manifest in the defeat of fascism. It's manifest in Truman's support for the United Nations, in Eisenhower's stirring conviction in his 1958 State of the Union address that the only answer to a war, the only answer to a regime, the Soviet Union, to a regime that wages total war, is to wage total peace. It's manifest in the civil rights movement. It's manifest in the resistance to all those pinched souls who would not be where they are today if their immigrant ancestors had been treated the way they propose to treat the next generation of American citizens. And it's manifest in the courage of lawyers. And let's not forget this, they are largely military lawyers who have defended prisoners at Guantanamo Bay and who have given their careers for that courage and that defense. Draw upon these parts of the American tradition, and we not only repair our reputation, we reestablish ourselves as the human rights leader that we all want America to be. The challenges to human rights are still immense, but the odds of its ultimate triumph are even greater because, as I said at the end of the day, human rights emerge out of the common misery of humankind, signaled as it is by that lump in the throat. The sad but gentle truth that the angel of death perches on the shoulders of every one of us, and in the face of that truth, human rights give voice to our deepest yearnings for things like the reconciliation of adversaries, the eradication of fear, a better life for our children, a fair distribution of the earth's abundance, not an equal distribution of the earth's resources, not equal, nobody asked for that, just fair, just enough water to drink. In the midst of the 1994 Rwandan genocide, a girls' school was attacked by machete-wielding militiamen in the middle of the night. The teenagers were rousted from their beds about 2 a.m. and forced to line up in the dining hall. And then they were ordered by the militia to separate themselves by ethnic tribe. Hutu over here, Tutsi over there, so that only the Tutsi would die. But the girls didn't move. And a second time, the militia commander ordered them to divide up by ethnic group. Hutu over here, Tutsi over there. But a second time, the girls didn't move. And finally, one little girl, though naturally terrified, raised her hand tremulously. "I'm sorry, sir," she said. "I'm sorry, sir, but we cannot separate ourselves, you see. You see, we cannot separate ourselves because, you see, sir, in this school, we are not Hutu, we are not Tutsi, we're all just little Rwandan girls." At which point every one of the girls was slaughtered. But what a legacy they leave. We are not Hutu, we are not Tutsi. We're all just little Rwandan girls. And that sentiment expresses what is most fundamental about human rights, that we're all in this together. And the echoes of that young girl's voice bespeak a graciousness for which the world is desperate. Human rights have a future. How vibrant it will be depends upon our capacity to remember the fragility that every single one of us shares. Just that.